All right, welcome everybody to the Relatively Relevant AI podcast. We are joined today with Lisa Schnare. Say hello, Lisa.
Hi, everyone.
As always, we've got Lori. Lori, it's great to see you as always.
Hello.
So today we're going to tackle a topic that probably a lot of you have at some point ranted about if you hang out with any of us. And it's the challenge that we see with leaders, managers, and the people side of their job, whether it be the coaching, whether it be the empathetic connection, having difficult conversations, and the inability of a large number of those managers to have those conversations because they can fall back on, hey, I'm going to track this piece of activity or I'm going to check this list off. And we think that there's going to be a huge change in what's really going to be focused on for effective leaders with the advent of Gen AI and the things that are going to change. So it was one of the things that we started kind of pre-gaming about and talking about before we hit record 3 or 4 times because of user error on my part. But we finally got it rolling. And so I'm kind of curious, Lisa, why is it a hot button topic or a passion topic for you? What is it for you that, comes to mind when we start thinking about the challenge that leaders are facing or going to be facing as the technology continues to become more pervasive?
Ooh, what a question. So particularly top of mind for me when we were discussing what we wanted to discuss today, because I feel like a lot of leaders, it's not just recent, this is something that's been going on for a while, but a lot of leaders come into those positions either without a lot of actual people management experience or coaching experience. Sometimes they're just promoted because they were the top individual contributor, particularly in sales, and they take it because it's a promotion, but they don't actually think about all of the things beyond the metrics, beyond the technology that they need to be able to handle. And so when those difficult situations come up with their teams, particularly when you think about performance, when the AI and the technology can tell you all about the metrics, but it actually can't tell you how to be a person and how to be a person with your team. I see a lot of people, this actually came up just with a potential client the other day. I see a lot of leaders jump back into the individual contributing role. So they start to do their team's job for them instead of helping them to do the job well. So that's kind of one of the reasons it was top of mind for me. But then Lori, in all of her brilliance, took that and made it sound way better. So then I was hell yeah.
I'm sure it was a good thought. No, I agree with you. It's interesting where metrics are involved, where it feels safer for a lot of leaders. And I just came from a big Fortune 500 company where I got to see it played out against many, many levels, and then have had a long time consulting as well, where if you have metrics, typically there hasn't been new metrics created in a really long time, right? Like we're still using the same metrics that we were when we were measuring the production line to make cars 100 years ago. And so when you see leaders who are falling just to metrics, what is interesting is they're probably playing a safer game, right? Like they themselves are not fully being their own person or the people skills that they have, because this is what the company is telling them is important. And so because the metrics haven't really evolved lately, what you see is a lot of leaders relying on activity versus relying on outcome. Like, yes, your team is doing all this activity, but are you achieving? Is that activity achieving the goals you need? And it can be hard. I mean, I can definitely say it's been hard for me as a leader sometimes to be like, well, why are you having me measure this if this is the outcome? But we all have those games we have to play sometimes to meet up with the company expectations of how the board or how the next executive team wants to see those reports. But
it gives them a place to hide. It gives them a place to hide. Let's just call it straight, right? Like of all the leaders that we work with on over and over and over, you can tell the ones that hide behind, I'm going to measure this metric and only this metric, because they're not a fully developed person enough to be able to be communication chameleons, right? Like I have to talk in different ways to different people. I have to approach different people in different ways. And in order to do that, you have to have a pretty solid foundation in themselves. And a lot of them don't. And then on top of that, we're not giving them anything that's going to help them be better coaches other than them being able to say, hey, they hit this metric or they hit that metric. Well, that isn't necessarily success. And I think with Gen AI in the workplace, that's just it's going to be a much clearer divide and a bigger challenge for a lot of them to jump over.
Definitely. Yeah. I was thinking that as you were talking, Lori, as well as like blame game.
Yes.
Yes. We play the blame game. But I saw a piece of your content today, Lori, as well on social media about patterns and people's patterns. And I think that ties in so nicely to the way that Chad just said it too, is like, with generative AI disrupting things. And really, if you're a person who's very safe and happy in your pattern, in the way that you do things, in the way that you work, in the way that you work with people, then you're not comfortable with those changes. And sometimes, I like to think in some cases, hopefully, you may just be completely oblivious. So, I do like to get.
Do you think people really are? Like, so many people are just miserable, or like, oh, if this leader, right? Like, it feels like every person I talk to, as you saying the blame game, like blames somebody else. So it's like we all start running these patterns of our own, and then that becomes the pattern of our culture, right? All of these multiple different games. But I don't know, are people really oblivious? Like,
yeah, they're oblivious.
Some of them.
I would say that some of them don't know enough to know they're oblivious. Like it's just what they know. Like they come into these organizations that are hierarchically structured. They're measured on the metrics. Everybody's looking at the ratio of the gear turning. You're given a list of, hey, you were good at the metrics when you were an individual contributor. So maybe you'll be good at measuring the metrics when you become a leader. And there's multiple gears you have to pay attention to. But that misses the whole point of, coaching and up leveling the teams to be better at their jobs, which requires a different skill set. And so I'm not even sure they're aware of it in some cases. I mean, more experienced people are probably a little bit more aware. And again, you are the eternal optimist.
I know. I was just thinking that. I'm like, I have faith that people are aware of the energy that they're putting out there.
And it's funny that you called her an optimist for that, because in my mind, we're being optimists in hoping that they're actually oblivious.
That is true, right?
Well, hope is not a strategy, right?
Right.
That leads to something else, which is, why can't we have these open conversations with people at work to actually say, like, when you are confronted with somebody who it is very clear that the people around them are not benefiting from their leadership, or they're stuck and frustrated, and a good example is people who feel like a martyr, like they're the ones having to do all the work, like you talked about a manager doing the individual contributor role. But is it really just that we're not touching the touchy conversations? We're not having that real conversation to say, hey, do you realize that your team gets really upset after they interact with my team? Or are we just being so nice that we're afraid to have real honest conversations that could be productive because they feel safe?
And that's a really good point. And I'll say from my most recent experience in corporate before I went into the wild, was that a lot of people on other teams. So at the last company I worked for, I was the manager, director of sales development and operations in one of the other offices. So I was on the LT team, but I was also a mid-level manager, which was an interesting, startups. Anyway, but one thing that used to happen all the time is that people from other teams would tell me about the challenges they were having with their managers. And so they found it easier to approach me than they did their own manager about their manager's behavior. And then I could then go forward and say, like, hey, I'm hearing this feedback, like, this is not my place to tell you what to do, what not to do, but I'm hearing this from your team. And as somebody who is, well, I won't say comfortable, but is experienced at having uncomfortable conversations, I had no problem doing that. But that's a great point, Lori, is like, if their team members are unhappy, where would they go? Who would they go to? And then how are we actually relying on other people in the organization to action on the fact that they've got an unhappy team that with a manager that's maybe not the right fit? So it comes down to the question as well, is like, does your company even know what to do when that happens? And who's responsible for it?
And if you think about it, there was an Axios report, I think it came out last year, that said something like roughly, and I'll use the conservative number, is that just because of poor communication or the inability to have these types of communications, on average, organizations are losing $15,000 annually per employee. Now, combine that with the lost revenue we know exists because of poor leadership in general, you're talking about a pretty significant problem. And I don't know why people don't kind of look at it to try and fix it. Up to this point, I think it's just going to get worse, or I shouldn't say worse, more pronounced. It's going to get more pronounced as generative AI creeps into the workplace, because those automated tasks are going to be automated, and all you're going to be left with is, do you know how to communicate effectively? And to your point, Lisa, people will find the leadership they need. They will find the coaching they need. They're not necessarily going to follow always the hierarchical architecture of an organization. It's really the energy exchange and the empathetic communication, the emotional communication, the people that are able to have those conversations, kind of, Lori, to your point, the honest conversations, right? That they're not afraid of the judgment that may be perceived. And they're going to seek that out. They're going to find it. The question becomes, how do organizations or just even teams capitalize on that?
And I think that there's something, I like what you brought up, Lisa, about the ELT and who actually is accountable. And some of my, the interesting thing to me has always been that it doesn't feel like when you're, working with the ELTs, that they necessarily actually are measuring anything themselves or trying to get the pulse of a culture. It's all like more of, I have these 20 activity things, you have these 20 activity things. Oh, look, together we're making X amount more dollars, but nobody's talking. There's no reports out there that looks at like flow. Like, how do you measure where companies are getting stuck in the mud or where they're moving too fast? There's nothing in our standard set of reports. And that is including from, many of the big ERP systems out there, Oracle, Salesforce, all of that actually does measure, like, is this team hitting their outcome goals? They're measuring a lot of their productivity in terms of activity, but it does really lay that, shouldn't it be on the executive leadership team to say, am I aware of the real feelings that are going on? And I'm going to be accountable for the people aspect of my company.
Yeah, I think a lot of frustrated HR people would speak up right now if they were here talking to us. Just because I worked with some really great HR, like, people leaders, people, what do they call it? People in culture of now. They don't really call it HR anymore. But I worked with some great ones who truly did care, and they wanted to make a difference, and they tried to measure employee satisfaction. Like, we had internal NPS scoring. We had, like, not so much what you're talking about as far as like process and flow, or like, that flow of information, energy, that kind of thing. Like, it wasn't so much that, but they were trying to get a pulse on, like, okay, what teams are happy? What are they happy with? What are they frustrated with? And then to try to action that. So I actually got to take advantage of a mastering leadership, like, coaching course that they brought in. And the thing is that it was opt-in. So as a manager, I was like, yeah, of course. Like, I'm very like, give me all the training you possibly can give me, especially you guys are paying for it. Like, hell yeah, sign me up. But I know how expensive that shit is. But yeah, but because it was opt-in, I think it also then shone a light on the people that didn't take advantage of the fact that they could have that training. And so, but then who notices that gap? And then what do you do about it? Because that people team in particular was incredibly frustrated with, like, the lack of then executive action on the results of all of that research. So yeah, I think it's a tricky place to live. And I think that it's something that's, I don't know. I know that the three of us, I would put us in this group because, Lori, I haven't known you that long, but I feel like I've known you from afar, she says creepily. But you get people who kind of have a natural instinct and a natural capability for having sincere conversations, authentic conversations, and not afraid. Like a lot of things that they call a conflict conversation, I don't even see that way. I'm like, why is that a conflict? Like, if you're calling it that from the get-go, you're setting it up that it's going to be a negative interaction. When I had to, the only 2 times, I was very fortunate, only 2 times I actually had to fire people, like not lay people off. That's a different conversation we can have another time. And there was a lot of crying, but from me. But the 2 times I had to fire people, it actually started with like, hey, how do you think I think this is going?
Oh,
it's a good question, though.
That is a good question.
Because it only really works well when you've got a metrics driven role, because going back to metrics in sales, as anyone who is measured on a KPI, you should know that when things aren't going well, because it's pretty damn easy to find out. And not only by the way, it's visible to your entire organization. So everyone knows.
Mm-hmm.
So I just pointed that out. I just said, look, I'm not the only one who looks at the numbers, but as me, how do you think I think it's going? And both times the person just went, yeah. And 6 months later, they both messaged me on LinkedIn and said, like, that was the best thing you could have ever done for me. And they'd found what they were supposed to find and went off to be perfect little butterflies in their happy little world. So, like, that was actually the best thing that you could do for somebody who also, you got to think, sits at home on a Sunday night and dreads going to work the next day.
Yes. Like, that is so real, right? Like, if you're in the wrong environment, it might be the right role. It might, or the wrong role. It might be the wrong company, but we are so afraid to make movement as leaders. I don't know what it is about our society, but there's a stick-to-itness that even when all the signs are clear, it's wrong, that you don't want to be seen as a bad people leader by bringing up the conversation of like, this is just not the right fit, whether it's culture fit, whether it's talent fit, whether it's skills fit. It feels like we're afraid to bring that up. And I'm more concerned with the leaders who want to, as AI comes up, the leaders who just want to dictate and say, here's the list of 10 things, do them. Those people are going to be really working themselves out of a job very quickly, because AI is going to help that. But for the other people, it's like, how do we start that conversation of your job as a people leader is to lead people. And that's much more like a coach than it is being a director who gives a list of 10 things to do. Chad always talks about it as order taking versus critical thinking. And there is no question with this, the way AI is going to be coming up, that give it a year, 2 years, like order taking is not going to be, it's not even going to be a role anymore.
Well, and then I wonder how organizations adapt to the next evolution of this, because the vast majority, not always, but the vast majority of times we run into this all the time. The person who was the best IC, the individual contributor who crushed it, whatever crushed it meant in whatever role it was, they're like, oh, well, you should become, you should be a manager. And the organization almost inflicts this perspective of management's more important than coaching.
Oh,
and so now you've got a situation where not only is the skill set that's going to have to be at the forefront of their ability to execute, connecting with people, empowering people, having those conversations, but you're looking at an organization that's going to have to change the way they measure the success of those individuals. And I'm going to be really interested to see how or if organizations adapt to that, because I think it's a huge opportunity. I think it's a huge opportunity to rethink that future of work, like how we do business, and find people that enjoy those roles, because there are some people who go from individual contributor into management and after about a year go, no way, I want to go back to being an IC, because the people side of this sucks.
But we have weird hierarchy of pay limits on if you're in this role, even if you're the biggest contributor to the entire company, we still have those hierarchy roles of you can't get this much money unless you're moving up the people leader chain, which again, I'm not sure how that we all accepted that, because it's just, everybody doesn't want to be a people leader. But to be optimistic, can I ask you guys a question of, right? If we think about the future of work, like what do you think would be really helpful? What was something that you would wish that, leaders going forward would really embrace so that we can imagine a workplace that's different, that includes the people and the people leadership.
Because I think this goes right back to what you had said, the way you had said it, Lori, is the checklist. So I actually, that resonates with me because one of the things I actually coach people on or delivered to people when I was consulting with them is what I call a manager cookbook. And the cookbook is, this is what you should be looking at daily. This is what you should be looking at weekly, monthly, quarterly. And those things can easily be done by AI. So I think that part of the job should be automated by AI. Then the entire job becomes the coaching aspect, because the other side to something you just said again is like the people who were individual contributors who crushed it, they become managers because of the pay scale. One of the other things that's a limit though to a great coach is the fact that if they weren't a great individual contributor, they're not considered for that management promotion, even though they'd be way better at enabling the team to hit those numbers than they were at hitting them themselves. I've seen that before too. So it's something to like broaden our minds out a little bit when it comes to looking for the specific skills that can't be taken over by AI. When it comes to that connection with people, when it comes to that empathy, when it comes to that direct conversation, that is something that I don't really give a crap if you were an awesome salesperson. I need you to know how that job works so that you can coach properly to it. But I didn't need you to crush it. I need you to crush coaching other people how to crush it.
I would love to see, so that you get into that pay scale thing. And that's a really interesting situation. I would love to see base compensation with variable on some basis, monthly, quarterly, whatever, for influence and outcome. Like something that's, because everybody has ebbs and flows. Some other people are going through certain things in their lives and they need to, maybe they're not as engaged or they can't be as present. And other times, you're really involved in something you're passionate about and it goes up. I would love to see some type of way to measure that and in a way that ties to compensation, because that I think might free up the ability for people to say, hey, I don't necessarily want to do this, but I can be really good at this. And it's really going to be more about the impact on others and the impact on the whole to achieve some outcome. Although the problem with that is you still run into the typical top-down shareholder value is measured by Wall Street satisfaction, blah, 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 blah. But if we're talking, puppies, rainbows, and unicorns, I would love to see compensation reevaluated and recreated. I think there's ways that we may be able to figure that out. It's not going to be easy, but that would be interesting. That'd be something interesting for me in the next evolution. What about you, Lori?
I think I would love to see purpose brought into the future of work. Like when companies are building and rethinking and setting their 3 to 5 year vision, that it's not a strategic roadmap with 2 million lists of things to do, that it is very clear on this is what we're focused towards. So leaders actually owning that as a coach, as a leader, you have to make sure that you can align, create a clear vision or a clear destination for people to get to so that there is more purpose in work. I think you would get a whole bunch of stuff, way more stuff done. Definitely the compensation, but also if you could get people to feel their own value of like, hey, I know how to make that happen with so much less. You don't need to monitor every step of every of your employees' everyday work. And if you do, you should fire those employees or fire yourself, because that is a waste of time for the company.
Well, and it brings me back to like, I don't know. I mean, everybody's different. Everybody has their own reasons for the things that they do, why they want, why they put up with certain things or engage in environments and cultures. And we're seeing some more pushback, like generational divides. We're seeing pushbacks on those cultures, but like, we all have heard about the companies that are logging keystrokes, right? Or have installed things on computers that will determine how engaged they are with work or what's going on. Like if you're in an environment where you have to measure people that much, what do you think the outcome is going to be for the types of employees that want to be there? Right?
Like, where's the
what kind of
trust?
value you're going to get? And trust is a big one.
Yeah.
Like, I just don't,
Oh.
I couldn't do it.
That micromanagement, it's a beast. I mean, there's certain things, like I ran a remote team way before COVID ever came about. And like, so when everybody was freaking out about remote management, I was already like, I've been doing this for ages. I had a team in Toronto. I lived in Halifax. They're not close together. Sorry, Americans, they're not. Anyway, but it's one of those things where it's like, yes, there's a certain, like almost going back to the checklist idea. There's a certain amount that is like standard. Okay, so things that people maybe even to this day don't know they can check is I can see when somebody starts a session on Salesforce, when they log in. I can see when that session expires, whether it's from idleness or because they exited out of the program. And that was back before there was all this other technology. So then on top of that, I can track activity because that's in the system. So I can see how many emails were sent, how many calls were made. I can see their calendars. So I can see what's booked into their calendars. Something else I can do is just call them and see if they answer their phone.
What an idea.
I would do, what an idea. I know people. It's like groundbreaking. Like take a breath. But I would do that if there was nothing in their calendar that was booked with a customer or in another internal meeting or something. Then I would just call them and say, "How's your day going?" And if they didn't answer, I'd be like, "Hey," and then I'd try a few minutes later. Hey, and then when they answer and they're like at a movie, like, okay, we got to talk about that. But all of that stuff, again, could be monitored by AI. AI could then tell you this person was in at this time, that their session expired at this time. It could give you that report. That's so easy. So then on top of that becomes so this actually happened. I had an SDR, this was years ago, who way back then figured out that he could hire somebody on Elancer overseas for 25 cents a line to build his list for them and clean them up. So his amount of time that he spent building lists for his own prospecting for his own territory, he outsourced, and he figured out how to do that, and he hit his numbers. Do you think he got in trouble for then taking that time off?
No.
I was like, damn, why didn't I think that?
That was really good. That's a really good idea, right? Efficient.
Right? I was like, Jesus, when I was an SDR, I should have figured that out. So I was his manager, and I was like, hey, you hit your numbers and you do it like ethically, of course, then yeah, I'm all for it. I actually don't give a shit how you did it.
Right.
And neither do my bosses, right? So, because we are revenue driven team. And he was taking the time he got back from not having to do that to do the things he was interested in. So he was happy. He was happy in his job. He was a great performer. I was sad to lose him when he finally found out that he could get a better job. But that's the thing, is like, why does it matter? If, as long as, like I say, they're ethical, they're not, he didn't hide it from me. He told me about it. Like, why is that a problem?
Well, and that kind of creativity, I think, is going to be key. It's going to be key
Right?
as we watch this tech, sweep in. And so, all right. So as we think about, the people problem with people management, or whatever we're calling this episode, I can't remember.
People suck, basically. Yeah.
If you had to give the people that are listening like one or two pieces of advice, like, hey, this is something to check yourself on or look into in order to help up level your skill for being more effective, what pieces of advice would you give them?
I can start with that.
Go for it.
I would say, if you're asking your team the same questions all the time that your boss is asking you, my advice would be start asking different questions. Ask more probing questions that actually are cause your team members, right, to think about what you want them to be thinking about. So my tip would be to change up your questions to really be asking more deeper questions that will help change the thinking of your team.
Can you give it? I want to go a little deeper on that. Can you give me an example? Like what would one of those be?
So, right, like if I'm running a product team and I say, oh, where is it at? Blah, blah, blah. And somebody comes back to me and says, oh, in this sprint, we completed this, and this. I can sit if that's all, and that's all I need to report to, my higher ups or something like that. But I actually can continue on that questioning and saying stuff. So how much, how much closer are we to actually, making Salesforce the trusted source for all of ours, like add a deeper question about what's the actual company goal we're trying to hit, so that I'm requiring my team to associate their activity with the corporation's goal to actually help them start making the connection to the higher vision.
Yeah.
Make
So
sense?
you don't end up in a situation where you ask somebody, why are you doing that? And they say, I don't know.
Yes.
My boss told me
That.
My boss told me to do that. No, that's
Mhm.
not the right answer. All right. So
I
what
build
would you
widgets.
say, Lisa?
I built widgets. Yeah. So I would say I would actually add on to Lori's, because I'm actually going to take it to the personal side and say that what you're doing there, Lori, what you're recommending people do there is actually get a full understanding of their own worth to the company, because their value to the company is tied to that corporate goal. They are one of the key paddlers in the canoe. And if they stop paddling, the canoe goes in circles. So like to actually make that connection, I think is a really great example of their personal worth. But also I think as a leader, and where the checklist cannot connect with people the way we can, understand what's going on in people's lives. I mean, don't get super personal, but like, hey, and so you got those things done. That's awesome. How do you feel about it? Like, are you able to go home a little earlier now? Getting into that personal side of things, right? And really, like, you should know a little something if you're connecting with your employees about what's going on in their lives. What are their aspirations? Even if that is tied to career aspirations, like, you should know that. And so don't hesitate to take it a step further from the personal side as well. It's like, how do you feel about that? Second thing I would say is, so God, I've totally lost my train of thought. Let's just stick with that.
Perfect.
Awesome.
It's like, yeah, be personal. Ask the question. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate the conversation as always, Lisa. I know we're going to do another one of these at some point. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. Been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We look forward to seeing you on another episode.